Welcome to the seventh and final session in the series we've called L&D's Pivot to Performance, in which Guy Wallace and myself, David James, speak with esteemed guests about their own pivot from learning-focused practice towards a performance orientation that more predictably and reliably, let alone efficiently and successfully, achieves demonstrable results for both employees and organizations. Over these 7 sessions, we've invited guests that we know have made the pivot and have achieved real results from doing so. We've invited our guests to share their stories, we've questioned them on their approaches and encouraged them to share relatable experiences to inspire you to either initiate or enhance your own pivot. We've also sought opportunities for you to get involved too. Now, one last time, Guy, should we kick off with our introductions?
Please, let's do.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm David James. And I suppose most notably, I spent 8 years at Disney running learning talent and OD. And my own pivot to performance came when in that position, I realized that I was no longer being asked for training courses. I was asked to make actual change, and everything that I'd learned in the classroom for the last 10 years wasn't as useful as I'd hoped. So hence I trod on this path. Guy?
Yes, my name is Guy Wallace. I've been in the business since 1979. In 82, I became a consultant. But I think I was one of the lucky few in that when I joined the profession, I was taught the methods of the late Gary Rumler, Tom Gilbert, Joe Harless, and Bob Mager, 4 outstanding individuals in the learning and development profession, or training and development it was called back in the day. And they all had a performance orientation. And so they looked at times beyond learning if it wasn't a knowledge and skill deficit that they were confronting with their clients. So I learned that kind of an approach, to be wary of just answering the client's request with instruction when in fact there may have not been a knowledge and skill deficit at the root of their cause or their problem or their opportunity. I'm partnered with David so that we could try to bring to our audience the people who actually are doing this nowadays and have experience doing that. And so let's continue with the introductions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Guy. And before we get into those introductions, I would like to welcome our panelists. First of all, welcome back our panelists, I should say, Anne-Marie Burbidge, Dawn Snyder, Sebastian Tindall, and Steve Villachica. Welcome back. So if we could do some quick introductions then, perhaps we can start with you, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, thank you for having me back. Good to know that I got a re-invite. Thank you. So yeah, I'm Anne-Marie Burbidge. I have worked in learning and development for 15 years. Started out in a generalist HR role and then specialised. It's interesting, I've been doing some reflecting. I did some consultancy. Most of my work has been in-house L&D, but I have done some consultancy. And actually thinking back, one of the things that always bothered me a little bit was, how I was unable to make the same kind of relationships and assess the impact of my work in those roles. So then when I more recently moved into an L&D leadership role, that was a vision that I was really keen to create. So what does good look like from a performance kind of point of view for learning and development, and then take a team on that journey. And that's me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anne-Marie. And Dawn?
Hi, thanks again for having me back. I love to talk shop. And like Guy, when I started in the field, I learned some formal methodologies that were really performance focused. I love having an impact. And so in my work, I do a lot of work with performance analysis and a lot of work in evaluation. And when you're evaluating the work that you do and the work that others do, it becomes very quickly apparent what strategies and what things are really having the impact that's intended, while others just kind of give lip service to performance. So I'm delighted when anyone has an interest in performance and moving our field forward so that we can have an impact on our learners. My practice is mostly curriculum development for capacity building and high stakes performance. And I operate mostly as a consultant doing this work.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dawn. Sebastian?
Thanks, David. So thanks for having me back. I guess I owe a bit to yourself, David, as I've mentioned in a number of podcasts. I think I've been doing the role now for about 14 years. I've held strategic roles at the Co-op Bank, Santander, and I'm now the head of learning development of Vitality. I guess upon reflection, a number of those years working that count of 14, I was probably doing it quite wrong. And it took that epiphany to kind of make me realize that and look back now and say, if I knew what I knew today, I would have done things so differently. And I guess that's really spurred me on over the last few years to completely redefine how I see L&D in an organization and try and redefine how others see that and try and push the boundaries of what we can do to add value to the businesses that we work in. So it's been a brilliant journey, but absolutely trying to voraciously push forward and find out what the future is. And I think that's what we're all searching for and why we're all here today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sebastian. And finally, Steve.
Thanks, Guy and David. I'm so glad to be part of this panel today. I'm an associate professor of organizational performance and workplace learning at Boise State University. We're an online master's program. Before that, I was a performance consultant for almost 20 years. Our OPWL program focuses on performance improvement. We're about working with adults in the workplace to improve organizational performance and produce valued results. We've been online since 1987. In addition to consulting, I provide pro bono consulting for nonprofit organizations and graduates. And I'm the co-founder of a process management lab that helps nonprofit organizations build capacity by improving process, thereby helping them better meet their missions and serve their communities.
Wonderful. Thanks, Steve. And just to remind those of you who've joined us, the panel are here to answer your questions, either about initiating your pivot, either exploring the experience of our panelists so that you can understand the pivot, or perhaps to enhance what you're already doing. But if you could pop your questions in the Q&A. We've had some questions in already, and as a segue between this session and the last one, Steve would like to continue the conversation that we had a couple of weeks back, because Charles Jennings submitted a question that we didn't get a chance to answer, and he asks, have you used the business model canvas approach to support solution design, particularly to define and enable effective holistic L&D solutions rather than formal training?
No, I hadn't thought to do that. It could be a really good idea. If your organization is already used to using business canvases as a way to pitch ideas and solutions, then I think it's, certainly easy. They're modifiable, and you can include information about the performance gap, its causes, and how those solutions relate to them. And so what's neat is it's a one-page representation of something complex. There are other ways of representing this stuff. And I think that brings up a larger question of how do you show this stuff to especially senior people who have the attention span of gnats. And the neat thing about the canvas is it's a one-page representation of something complex. In his Anatomy of Performance, Gary Rumler has this neat one-page diagram that shows the story of a performance gap and how it affects the entire organization, its processes, and the people doing the work. One page. I also think that graphic artists are powerful, and we have opportunities to work with them in ways to depict the story of our performance gap in a similar one-page, easy to digest format.
And I think thank you very much, Steve. I think what we've discovered during all of these conversations is whilst we employ a performance orientation, we do that in a different way. I wonder if anybody else uses a similar, perhaps one-page, either graphical or way of illustrating the solution design.
Well, I'll go in with full disclosure. I Googled the business model canvas this morning.
Oh, yeah.
Because I thought, well, that's quite interesting, because I'm learning as I go through this. And actually, when I look through some of the questions in there and the template, I think it's really interesting. It pulls together a lot of things that I think that if we're working well in our roles, that we should be thinking about. But I've never seen it laid out quite like that. So I encourage anyone to take a look, actually.
It's particularly helpful. I mean, one piece of advice I had when I was running the UK Learning and Development Department at Disney, and I had a mentor outside of the organisation. I said, "What is it that I can do to ignite business conversations with my stakeholders rather than learning conversations?" And it was really easy. You say, "Well, when you see them in the lift or in the coffee queue, you ask them, 'How's business?'" And that was it. And it's amazing the conversations that you have, that you're not talking about learning, and you really are shifting perceptions from of yourself and your value. That's what I like about the business model canvas. It has you thinking about the business that you're supporting. If we then move on, it's encouraging to see that we have questions in the Q&A already. Thank you very much for that, Kayla. We'll come to it very shortly. But we have a question, and Anne-Marie, I wonder if I could ask you this one to start with. You've made the decision yourself that you want to stop simply making learning stuff and chasing engagement, and you want to more closely align your effort to making a demonstrable difference, i.e., predictably and reliably affecting performance. How do you convince those around you in L&D, your boss in HR, and your senior stakeholders who simply ask you for training?
Mm-hmm. And also whoever might be an end customer that comes asking for training, I guess. And it's interesting. I promise I'll give an actual answer to this question and with some advice. But my first thought is, why do you need to? Why do you need to convince other people? You know, like what's that? You know, where are you? And actually, if you just need to convince yourself, firstly, to make a start, and this is our performance enablement, right? Why do we need permission to do a good job in our world? And so just mull over what that convincing looks like to you, and what you will have when you feel like you have convinced everybody before you take those steps forward. But I promise I'll give you a proper answer. I think for me, I did not at any point just wake up and go, right, that's it, no more training. It was definitely evolution, not revolution. And I think kind of take that pressure off. I think start small because you can scale up. So the convincing, I think for me, the biggest convincer will always be data and evidence. Mm-hmm. So, I think one of the first things I'd be encouraging people to do is start where you are now. What data do you have now? What evidence, what kind of measures, what impact is, so if it's something that you're doing already, what impact is that having now that you want to change? If you're not doing anything yet, what's the current as-is state that you're looking to impact? Because it's much easier to demonstrate progress or demonstrate impact if you know the point at which you started at. I think in terms of convincing, what does the person you're trying to convince need to hear from you? Put yourself in their shoes. What does kind of safety look like? And I would be always encouraging you to start with something that maybe is less risky. I think your convincing job is much harder if there's high stakes for the person that you're trying to kind of get on board to try something different. And then once you've got your evidence, once you've got your data, you know where you're starting from, you've kind of reassured somebody and you've picked something small and low enough risk to at least try something, anything, just try something different. Give it a go. If you're going to fail fast, iterate, learn, build, and keep going. And actually go again. You can go round that cycle several times in the time it takes you to scope out, design, roll out, deliver, get feedback on a training solution. So I think the convincer is probably reassuring along the way, but don't feel like you've got to have that kind of permission and that approval right from the start for the whole thing. Build it as you go. And then those stories become your success stories and your convincers going forward, and you grow them. But I think the other thing that does come to mind with this question is, I think there's some L&D development needs in here. There's some of our skills that we need to think about around influencing, persuading, negotiating, maybe coaching, selling a vision, data, evidence, being able to track down the data, tell a story using the data and the insight. And then something around what I would call the product mindset, but the bit around continuous improvement, being okay with that. It doesn't have to be perfect straight out the back first time. So when you're trying to convince people to kind of do something a little bit different, know that you'll probably bump into some stuff on the way. Don't kind of make promises right at the outset. I'm convincing you of this thing that's going to be perfect, because it probably won't be, but just can we have a go? But I would say the convincer is probably something data-based and not so high risk that the customer feels like there's a lot at stake for them personally.
Yeah,
what I'd encourage everybody to do, a bit of a self-audit about how they feel about this and those conversations, and think about our own performance enablement.
Yeah, thanks, Anne-Marie. I think that you're absolutely right there. And I've been in that position where personally you put quite a lot of weight on getting something right or getting permission to do something, whereas perhaps what we're being asked to do, get involved in, or to address doesn't actually carry as much weight for the stakeholder in their own mind. Well, perhaps it does, that they want it done, but not in the method, perhaps where we think we want to create or deliver the perfect experience or program. They don't want perfect. They just want something that makes things better.
Mm-hmm. And we make assumptions, don't we? When we hear, well, I want training, and, we've spoken about this before, that's their vocabulary because that's what they think is the right thing to say, and so they ask for training. It doesn't mean you have to deliver training. It could be all sorts of things.
Yeah, wonderful. It's what you said in the conversation before. You take a request for training as a request for help, and I think that's a very productive way of doing so. Sebastian, what about you? So if you've made the decision yourself, and of course you clearly did, what is it that you needed to do, if at all, to convince your stakeholders, your boss, and the rest of your team in L&D?
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of bits in there. I think when people come and ask you for training, it's a solution presented to a department, and I think there seems to be a misconception with L&D professionals that we're the only department that gets that, but we're not. And if you spend time in other departments, they have exactly the same gripe, like our online sales aren't good enough, I want you to rework our website. That is happening all the time. It's exactly the same conversations manifesting themselves. I think that the challenge is that, I guess I see it every day, and I'm trying to be level, but something, they're trying to get something solved. It's just as Anne-Marie says, they're trying to get help, and the good news is they value people development, and that's why they're coming to you, which is, again, part of the battle. So I think from that moment, they're seeing you as an outlet for a training solution, but what they aren't seeing you as a department that can support with the diagnosis of issues. And I think if you can first position yourself as a function that can diagnose the root cause of a problem, that is just part of the value that you can add, and that is the start of that process. And I guess that the panacea is, we have a problem, let's get L&D to take a look at it and find out what that problem is. And I guess the way that you do that, you have to hold yourself to account for asking the right questions when it comes to, a balance of common sense, judgment, and experience. Just as Anne-Marie says, it's something that happens over a period of time, and it is a practice and it is a skill. Again, it's those standard questions, and I'm sure everybody has gone down that road. But you want training. What do you think that training will solve? What is the problem? How have you quantified the problem? And the conversation can just snowball, from there. And there's a million ways to kind of deal with that. And you can practice it every day and get better kind of as of now. But the one thing I'll leave as a parting point on this, and it's for people to reflect on, is that as L&D professionals, and particularly as strategic leaders, we've got an organizational responsibility to make sure that we're investing our team's time to generate the maximum value. So as a result, we need to make sure that we prioritize the most pressing business problems. So if we can find those problems, the conversations will quickly flip as well. So it's not to put too much weight on the conversation, find the issue, and then you're really talking about those good things. Like you were saying before in the lift, David, how is business is a pretty weighted question, and you'll uncover a lot of things from it.
Yeah, you really do. And if I can stick with you, Sebastian, for the next question, one comment or question I get probably above all others is somebody saying to me they'd like to modernize, but their line manager won't allow it, but won't give them permission. So it's usually L&D people saying, I can't do this. So they're anticipating either pushback or a tricky conversation with their line manager. So either their head of L&D or head of HR. Have you ever had resistance in that regard? And how have you handled a tricky conversation with those above you who are accountable for you and your team?
I think I have. Probably someone's had it with me. And I've also spoken to a number of people externally who want kind of advice on this sort of thing. And I think it's really difficult to condense conversations that can happen over an extended period of time into kind of short responses, but I kind of do my best. I think it always starts with having to unpick from the beginning in order to broaden the scope of what you are perceived to do as a department, the wider value that you need to be adding. Now, obviously, if it's your manager, then you need to approach that conversation with, the courtesy and care that it requires. As I understand that can obviously be daunting, especially if the current setup of the team is, perhaps a little bit antiquated and traditional. But, practical advice, the first thing I would recommend is to start to get closer to what projects the team supports and why. How do we decide where we invest our time, what we work on and why? And again, it doesn't matter if you change any opinions at that stage. That's just good practice to know. And I think once you start to become ingratiated into those conversations, I think the next thing to do is to start to get closer to how those needs present themselves. If you are being presented a need by your manager to say, hey, go and work on this project, then the best thing you can do, and it's cliched for a reason, and absolutely to underline the point from Anne-Marie, is to get into the numbers. And the early questions to your manager, like, what are my measures of success on this, and how will we know we've solved the problem, can really start to turn the conversations towards performance issues. Again, getting into the data and understanding the process of how things should work. I'm talking specific detail there, how they do work and what the barriers to performance are. They're all pretty nuanced and easy things to do without whipping up a formal, antiquated process. They're just good practice questions. And again, you're going to start increasingly creating forensic solutions that might and possibly, hopefully, won't be training based. And I guess the best question you can ask yourself, and potentially, to your manager, is, imagine that we couldn't train anyone on this. How could we still make sure they get it right every time? And as long as whatever you suggest impacts the success metrics, your foot is in the door, and the rest is up to you with what you do once your foot is in the door. So I think that would be my practical advice. But of course, that's not to minimize that is a pretty tough conversation to have wherever you are.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Sebastian. And Steve, I'm sure you've seen this as well. You've got a young buck, somebody who's eager and keen. They've been at the front of the classroom and thought, I'm sure this isn't adding the value that people are telling me it is. So you go to your boss, somebody who has risen through the ranks, doing established L&D practice. So they've all been promoted and rewarded for keeping things the same. And this young buck thinks, no, we want to be doing something differently. I mean, how do you approach those tricky conversations, or do you have, the stories of how that's been done successfully already?
Sure. In my experience, line managers are great. I love working with them. And the reason is that they have business goals and they tend to be straightforward. The goals tend to be understandable. And we can present ourselves as the folks who can help them with the messy people parts that are related to achieving those goals. I also like them because it's important to remember that economies ebb and economies flow. And line managers are the folks who can advocate for folks like us when organizations are cutting people who haven't recently done anything for them that matters. And so in addition to agreeing with everything that Sebastian said, I think it's also important to ensure you're ready to play with them first. And that means building your own or your organization's intelligence network that can provide timely, credible, useful information. So you need to do some research. Who are these managers? Where are they coming from? What are their responsibilities? Who are their predecessors? Can you relate what they do to the organization's mission, its vision, its values, its strategic business objectives, and its portfolio of current strategic initiatives? And then, armed with that, I think, using that how's business question, you can start approaching them to explore what keeps them up at night and what's getting in the way of their meeting their objectives. And then you have the ability to start aligning things you can do with what's important to them.
Mm.
And I think the starting place is being sure that you're ready to have a good conversation with them.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. Dawn. So many learning and development functions will be established already. There will be a curriculum that keeps many of the team busy, either in administration or delivery. And there will already be a suite of e-learning, perhaps in a fancy new LMS. Can you retrofit learning solutions like courses and e-learning to become performance solutions?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that, because right now we're remodeling a kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're retrofitting, it's not different really so much from remodeling. And your ability to be successful kind of has to do with how close the original is to the results that you want to achieve and to the current purposes that you have. So I say I'm hopeful, and I abhor waste. So if you're going to make changes in anything, I try to capture the value of things that are already done and already working. That being said, I hear a lot of people talking about retrofitting when they really haven't done an analysis that is sufficient to understand the gap in performance by all the stakeholding audiences and understand the cause or causes of those gaps. So they really want to start with a solution that may not be justified in the first place. There's a reason that when we start fresh, we're solution neutral, because it allows us to take advantage of the efficiencies of finding the lowest cost solutions and putting those in place. First, seeing if we're getting some impact by checking our leading indicators, and then moving to things that are more complex or more sophisticated or just more costly overall. So when you're retrofitting, one of the things I guess I would advise people to think about is to be very clear on the purposes and then understand what things have changed. One of the things that happens, for example, in curricula, and of course, these are more long-term, more longer journeys that we take people on. If the market changes and you're getting different people coming into your organization and starting in your curriculum may not be working because you actually have changed your target audience without acknowledging, you're just calling them new hires. So one of the things that I think is very helpful to monitor and understand at all times are who are the stakeholders and what are their needs and how are things changing, as time goes on, what forces are causing changes. And if you've inherited programs that you may not think are effective and you need that justification to retrofit, I would start with some really good analysis work, really good evaluation work that can help you justify additional efforts to expand the depth or breadth of the solution to be more impactful.
Yeah, what I like about that, Dawn, is it's not a case of asking the question of what have you got? It is asking the question, what works and how do you know that it works? I'm sure that there are learning and development teams who are very busy maintaining their curriculum, but as to answering the question, how do you know that it works beyond people are showing up? It's a very different set of questions. Anne-Marie, do you have any response to experience in this one?
Yeah, and look, I love all what Dawn said, and I agree with you. I just think that, for me, there's definitely something around the mindset that is, of course you can retrofit it if that's right, but of course you can chuck it out and start again if that's right, and of course you can iterate if that's right. The point is, what we got, what we not got, what's working, what's not working, what could it be? And sometimes, we ask kind of these questions. If we couldn't fail, what would we do? Or if we had a magic wand, what would we do? Or this is here now, but if we hadn't, I think Sebastian said before, if we couldn't train on this, what would we do? The point is, this is your product, this is your responsibility to make sure you're driving something positive. And so can you retrofit it? Yes, if that's the right thing. But so can you also not, if you don't think that's the right thing to do?
Yeah.
And just taking that mindset of, actually, my goal is to add impact, it's to drive individual or business performance, or both, hopefully. And so whatever the potential outcome is, yes, you can.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. So we do have questions in the Q&A, and before I hand over to Guy for those, if anybody in attendance would like to ask any other questions, either to the panel at large or to individuals, then please do so. Guy, I understand we do have some questions to kick us off.
Yes, we do. We have a couple from Kayla, and I think this has been kind of answered already. So, but her question is, how do you tackle your very first pivot attempt? Without a portfolio of completed work, I guess some success stories, I'm finding business buy-in challenging. They need to know everything is a hard hill to get over. So I think that perhaps Sebastian and Anne-Marie have kind of answered that one already. So let me shift over to Steve. Steve, what would be your recommendations on how to begin to establish buy-in when you're trying to do something perhaps different than what the request is all about?
In addition to what Sebastian and Anne-Marie have spoken about, I think I would add grow your sources of business intelligence so that you can find opportunities that are ready for that performance pivot. The other thing is, if you can't cite your own work, include in your organizational intelligence efforts the collection of things that are similar. So we've never done it here, but our competitors at ABC did something similar, and here's what they did, and how we might be able to do something similar would be my first approach to that. The second is to pick those opportunities carefully. If this is the first time you've ever done it, and it's never been done in your organization before, you can look to find something doable with minimal risk, or you could look to find something doable that has more risk. And determining that level of risk you can undertake is going to be a hard decision, because sometimes it's the risky places where people are going to be most willing to try something new, and you need to be able to deliver. Conversely, finding something that's similar that may not be as risky, and if you could get adequate sponsorship, might be a good place to start. So, grow your sources of organizational intel first, provide or identify similar cases, and be ready to make decisions about risk.
Yes, I think I like that. I always think that you've got to, work with your requester, your client, your stakeholders, and let them be part of that decision making. Should we try something different now? Is this the time and the place to do this? And share the decision making, or at least pose to them what some of their options are, and let them know that you're on their side and you're willing to, go whichever way that they, see as best. And go from there. Dawn, how do you approach that? How do you establish buy-in when there is perhaps resistance, and where the client wants learning content and that includes everything? How do you handle that?
Well, I would have to echo what everyone has said. I think you've gotten some really good advice. So let me give you a couple other pieces. One is, I don't tell them necessarily that it's different. I just do it. And in order to get sometimes outside the learning box, you have to have different partnerships, and you define your system boundaries differently. So you have to be very, very conscious of who you can partner with and what the organizational culture or structure can bear. So I would say, if you can do it, you may not have to ask permission. You just get people excited about doing the thing that seems to make sense to them. The second thing that I would say, and I often see it in novices, especially just folks who are right out of a graduate program, who have learned some concepts and learned some theories and really want to bring that to the party. We have a tendency to want to educate the people that we're talking to about what's going on in our minds. And frankly, they don't care. We just need to stay focused on the solution and what we're bringing to the party. And so when you encounter reluctance, Sometimes it's because we've actually put our own barrier out there and then we have to climb ourselves over it. And if we don't make it a barrier, if we just, when I had kids, I would grind up vegetables and put them in meatloaf. And they ate it just fine. And I didn't say, here's the meatloaf. And hey, I ground up all these vegetables that you don't eat otherwise, and I put it in there. You don't always have to say, hey, I'm making this big change and you're not maybe going to like it. So I think in addition, again, to what others have said, I think we need to be conscious that we're not creating our own barriers and that we're, again, taking a whole solution focus, and we don't care what we call it. We're just getting the pieces in place to make sure we can implement it successfully.
That was excellent. That reminded me of something that I learned from a colleague that some of us know, Jim Hill. He would, his clients was looking at Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, and the client said, "What do you call that thing?" And Jim said, "What do you want to call it?" Just to let the client be part of all of that. Let me go to the next question here again from Kayla. This is targeted at Sebastian, and this goes back to his earlier session with us. And I'm going to ask everybody to respond to this here, but she was intrigued by your reactive intake form process. And can you talk about a little bit more about the process of developing that form? Who was consulted? What did the first couple of beta attempts look like, et cetera? So how did you get to where you are with your intake process and the form that you used? But what can you share with us?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that I'm pretty mindful of is that one person's bureaucracy is another person's rigor. So, having a form in an organization, for some people will go, hey, that doesn't work for me. And there are definite, there are sliding scales in terms of how you approach this. I think when I've learned this from Microsoft Excel courses. God, I've trained some boring stuff in my past when you think about this stuff. But there was an old rule with Excel, which was if you're doing it manually every time, you're doing it wrong. And it's a rule that I apply to my own life. And I realized that I was sitting down with stakeholders who were coming to me and I was having exactly the same conversation every time. And after about 200 times in, I just couldn't be bothered. And I thought there's got to be a better way of doing this. And actually, how can I make that process informative for both parties? How do I get them to complete it, but actually it helps them articulate their business case, their problem, their performance issues in such a way that actually it's an exit point. And it's really interesting that when you get it right, people will contact you and say, I started completing your form, I went through it, and actually I realized what the problem was, so I don't need you. And then you go, brilliant, we have arrived. That is where you want to get to. Obviously it wasn't like that to begin with, but I guess the biggest issue we found is, and again, you are what you need to be in an organization. It's not as simple as saying, we're going in this direction. We are a huge, high change organization. Things change at the drop of a hat every single week. The byproduct of that is the traffic of perceived training requests into my team are huge. And that causes you to respond in such a way that, for me, it's not good enough to sit in an organization and say, we will serve whoever shouts the loudest. Absolutely not. This is about getting into a room together and arbitrating the business case based on the perceived value of what this is going to deliver. Pounds and pence wins. If you can articulate your business case well then it'll win and it'll get resource. Fantastic. So I think the departure point for that form really is to make sure that people are coming to you and actually doing it in a considered way that says, this is how it will influence our organization's performance and results. If you can quantify that, there's a really good chance that actually they've gone through and looked at the data themselves. Now, look, we will go through the data as well. But what we will find is that the form is there as a framework, but it should feel like someone can pick up the phone to you and say, I'm trying to do this, come and sit with me. And the irony is you then sit with them and you look at all of the business MI that they're completing and you start to get exposed to all of those issues. And actually you start to say, well, we were talking about this, but we've both just seen that. What are we doing there? What is the issue there? And you start to learn so much about the organizational areas that you support. Some of the problems are the same. And I guess that form is then circulated amongst stakeholders because everybody suffers in their own silo. But actually, very rarely do we go to people that we don't see on a frequent basis and say, this is keeping me awake at night. Because there's a professional decorum that says, you know, especially in the UK, how are you doing today? And you must say, I'm fine. Even if you are doing absolutely terribly, people don't go, oh my God, I'm having a problem with this. So this is just a way that actually we've seen it connect stakeholders to go, I'm having exactly the same problem. What are you doing about it? Well, I did this and it worked. Why don't you do that? All of that is part of the organizational development framework that can help just sharing problems with people. So I just think that the form, yes, I take it. You know, it's certainly a bureaucratic approach, but actually it's caused so many positive byproducts in our organization that I'm kind of aggrieved to get rid of it. So I do keep it, but I do realize that might cause a few frowns in the room.
Well, I'm all for that kind of an approach. And if I don't ask somebody to fill it out, I fill it out for them by asking them the questions and letting them see where this all goes. And then I can give them a copy of it afterwards. But I want to shift to Dawn as a consultant. And I see you're raising your hand, Steve. But Dawn, as a consultant, it's a little bit different when you're doing an intake for a potential project. You know, you may have to bid on it or whatever, and you may or may not get it. But what is on the front end of your process that's equivalent to the intake and understanding exactly what the issues are and what the client's ideas about the issue and the solutions are?
Well, that's a great question, Guy. And I have to say that my intake for my work is pretty similar to the intake that Sebastian talked about. And I've helped, my clients develop similar intake kind of forms so that they can very quickly sort things that are going to have a larger business impact and are worthy of additional investigation from things that are, we want training to say that we've done something. I think the thing that I always ask in addition to what somebody internally might have to ask is I have to make sure that the sponsorship is in place for the potential solution. And one of the biggest mistakes, I made this mistake, more recently than I would like to tell you. I undertook the responsibility of trying to help a client get some result, and she was not properly placed in the organization and didn't have sufficient sponsorship. That project was doomed to failure because you have to have, in order to do performance solutions, you have to have the change management support to implement the solutions. You can't come in and say, we think you need to change the incentive structure if you don't have someone on the team who has the juice to bring the right people to the table to even have that conversation. So in addition to the kind of questions about business impact and the ability to, get access to the resources you need, you really have to make sure that the organization is positioned and ready, that this is not your client's pet project, that you have access to sponsorship, and that there's really an energy by all the groups of stakeholders to carry this thing through to some conclusion.
Yes, thank you. Steve, as somebody who's involved in a university program, who also has the consulting experience of dealing with the things on the front end, what is it that you teach your students to look for on the front end to clarify the request, to understand what the stakes are and who the various stakeholders are? How do you approach that in the program at Boise?
The same way that Sebastian and Don are talking about. I don't think there's a lot of variability in there. It's choreographing a conversation that's able to turn, I need me some training, into a more productive conversation about business needs, goals, things that are getting in the way, and then sponsorship. Because without adequate sponsorship, we're not going forward. The only thing I could add is we tell our students that essentially the promise we're making or offering is that we're going to involve significant short-term and significant pain for the potential of long-term gain. So if we're going to play together, you need to sponsor this in ways that will provide the right people in the room as we need them. If we are getting into solutions that might involve learning, we need the opinion leading subject matter experts in your organization. And if it doesn't hurt to give us access to those people, we're talking to the wrong ones. If we're going to be doing adequate discovery, we need to be doing it systemically, and we need to be talking with all the people who are involved in this situation. And we need to talk, we need to collect different kinds of data in different ways, and then, like a good detective, corroborate it. But for us, it comes down to this promise of, if we're not talking about something that's important enough for this trade-off, short-term pain, long-term gain, then we're probably not really using each other's time well.
Yes, thank you. And Marie, so from your perspective, what are your secrets of success on the front end of engagements and working with the requester and the various stakeholders? How do you approach that?
Well, so I'm thinking, listening to everybody, there's kind of a maturity model, right, that sits alongside this. And some are more mature along this journey than others. I would say we're quite early on, actually. Same thing. So I have not had the conversation successfully a couple of hundred times to the point where I'm desperate to get a form in place, which, but I think that's, I guess that's, I'm on this journey the same as everybody else and all the people that joined us.
I've never done successfully 200 times. Let me just add that caveat in there because they really weren't.
No, but that's it, isn't it? And so it's definitely more conversation based for me at the moment, but asking those kind of questions. And actually, one thing I have learned is that it doesn't always happen right at the beginning. You might get a little bit of the way through and go, actually, there's something else. Something else has presented itself that I didn't know about, and that's all okay too. And we just deal with, make decisions around what you know at the time. But I think when you're taking that a smaller cycle of iteration and an iterative model, actually you've got scope for that, and you haven't kind of promised at the beginning, I'm going to go out and I'm going to solve all of your worldly problems in one hit, and if I don't, I've failed. Actually, it's taking things on much more of a journey. So yes, it's conversations. Yes, we have, funnily enough, we have, quite recently, I was part of a conversation where there was a form, so we formalized that conversation into questions, but definitely that in its own right will take an iterative approach to how well that form does the job. And actually it's a bit, I guess, like contracts. The reason why contracts end up so long is because people bump into things, and that forms another clause in a contract, right? That's probably what there will be more questions. And I think probably get to a point where not all the questions are relevant all the time, but they help to shape the conversation and they help to get people thinking in a slightly different way. So yeah, I'm definitely earlier in that journey.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we all need to be cognizant of is that you can ask all the questions and get perfect answers on the front end, but through your discovery or analysis process, you're going to uncover additional things that might be critical or just distractions. And so we've got to be careful about that as we gather intelligence. And I think this is why it's important to bring your client along in the process of analysis or discovery. Waiting until the end and then surprising them with the big ahas that you've uncovered, it may be too much too late. And so keeping them informed as you go along the process when you are confirming, as Steve said, what it is that you've been told at the very beginning, like a good detective would be corroborating.
I think, sorry, Guy, what I would just add is I think that also brings us back to those things at the beginning. What are the skills? What's the capability required of us? Because it's not just that, a form won't do all the work for you. There also needs to be, this kind of data establishment, data interrogation, telling a story with it, pulling it all together, relationship building, trust building, influencing. This is change. This is kind of sales in some respects. You're having to bring people along on that journey. And, so we have to look at our capability What are the skills that we need to have in place, and what do we need to feel quite confident with in order to go in and have these conversations? Because we've got the toolkit. I think everyone here, it's not just training, there are other tools in our kit, but actually getting from training, it's something Steve said earlier, getting from training to, well, I've got these other things or these other conversations that we could be having. That requires a different skill set on our part and confidence in different things.
I think that's absolutely right. We may not have a staff in place that has the competencies that are required for this. And sometimes, depending on how we divided and conquered up the work, we may have people who work on the front end and people who work on the back end. And so we need to make sure that the people that we have in place in our own processes are well prepared for doing that work. Unless everybody's a generalist and everybody's doing everything, the world has gotten too complex in our world for generalists to be, I think, ultimately successful, unless it's a small operation. But you can't be a graphic designer and a videographer as well as a business analyst successfully. Now, there are people who can do that, but let me turn it back to David here for our wrap-up round.
Yes. Before we wrap up, it's we've had a great deal of interest in this series, both in terms of signing up and attending, and in listening back to the recordings. Has anybody got any other final pearls of wisdom? You've been involved in 2 conversations now, each of you. You get the gist of the questions and perhaps some of the challenges being faced. Has anybody got any other final kind of words of wisdom to share for those who'd like to follow in your footsteps?
I think I would probably just add that, and it's a point that I think we've all made, is this is absolutely an iterative process, and I think once you're trying to explore in your organisation what works, you know that it's only going to work potentially in your own context. And doing sessions like this and speaking to fellow L&D professionals is absolutely critical, because I think the future of L&D exists. It's just not evenly distributed yet, and absolutely it's taking things from some of these conversations and experimenting in your own organisation to try and work. And I think if anybody is listening at home or is present today that have tried something in their organisation that's absolutely worked, no matter how small, I would just encourage everybody to be open with sharing it, either on LinkedIn or emails afterwards, because that's why we're all here, is to learn and to hopefully get better.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sebastian.
I would say just make a start somewhere, find something, because you can talk yourself out of this quite easily. You convince yourself otherwise. One of the question right at the beginning you asked me was, how do I convince other people? What do you need to feel? What do you need to know? What do you need to be convinced of before you just make a start? Get out of the traps and learn as you go. And I think that can sometimes feel a little bit uncomfortable, but no, it probably will feel uncomfortable. We're used to having all the answers. We're used to standing up and being the sage on the stage or whatever. But what's the thing? What's the smallest thing that you can do to start to build your trust, your confidence in others, and have a go? Because if you wait, I think I've said it before, if you wait for permission and all the stars to align, and you'll talk yourself out of it. So find an ally, find a small thing. And I think, like Steve said, sometimes the bigger things are, because they will have the biggest impact, to the things where people are prepared to be a little bit more brave, perhaps. But just for you, even looking at your own self-development or in your team, what one thing can you start with to just try and do something different and build your confidence along the way? Don't go from kind of nothing to a marathon overnight.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
So I would add to that, because I do a lot of work with emerging talent. And so you definitely want to start small. You're going to be working differently, because no one person can do this in a silo. We expect instructional designers to work with subject matter experts, but they have a very limited input. When you're doing performance improvement work, you're collaborating with a lot of stakeholders over a lot of organizational lines. So to Anne-Marie's point earlier, and Steve's, and I think Sebastian's as well, there's a new skill set you need in terms of that relationship building and collaboration. And I always advise people that they need to have the analysis and the evaluation skills. You have to understand how organizations measure success, how performance is measured, and how you can find existing data or create measures that will help you bring your insights to the table. And so those are some good starting places. And if you're considering that pivot, that's a place to maybe begin or to enhance in order to be effective.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dawn. Steve, anything to round us off?
It's been fun being in a conversation where our panelists have already touched on all the things that I'd otherwise say and have provided very sage guidance. The only thing I can add is this stuff ain't rocket science. I work in a college of engineering. I know rocket scientists. This isn't it. This stuff is pretty straightforward. It's pretty doable. And so I think if you grow sources of organizational intel, if you look at upgrading parts of your skill set, I think you will find those opportunities to start small and grow success over time. And I think this is an approachable and doable thing for most people and in most organizations, but it's getting over the initial fear of trying in many cases.
Wonderful. Thanks, Steve. And once again, thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Sebastian. And finally, again, thank you very much, Steve. If I can extend a thank you to Ken and Philip as well for their involvement in the series, which has been hugely enlightening for me. And I know we've had an incredibly positive response for those who've attended and listened back to the recordings. Guy, can I throw it over to you and ask if there's anything you'd like to say to help wrap us up?
Well, I'd like to answer Kira's question here about wondering about some ways to get better at business talk, understanding the language of business. I've been recommending and developing staff in the past when I've had them on financials. You know, what's a cash flow analysis? What's a balance sheet? What's an income statement? If you don't understand how score is kept in your enterprise, you can't play the game very well. So that's a start. Now, every business, industry, company, or institution has its own set of language. You need to understand what that is. But the financials, I think, are the cash flow is the life's blood of an organization, and you should understand finance and how things are done and looked at in your organization so that you can align with that rather than fight that.
Yeah, I agree there. And when I was at Disney, we serviced 14 different business units. And one of the key parts of my job was to find out how they made money, because that's what was important to them. And if you understood how they make money, and then you're curious, you have your conversations around that with them. And if they're not in the business of making money, they're a support function. How do they add value? What is their reason for being? And then you have your conversations around that. Thank you, Kira. What a lovely way to end the series then with that one final question. Thank you everybody for showing up today. Thanks everybody for downloading the podcast or watching the recording. This has been an absolute pleasure to be involved in, and guys already twisting my arm to do another series next year. So watch out for that. But in the meantime, thank you very much for being involved, and take care till then.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.